Hello and welcome to part 2 of the final showcase of the Boomsday project card reveals. There's about 30 cards to go through, so let's get right into it. First up is Brainstormer, 3 mana 3/1 neutral card with the battlecry, gain +1 health for each spell in your hand. So maybe you could include this in a draw mage, or a mage that includes a bunch of cheap spells. And if you only have 3 spells in your hand, this is a 3 mana 3/4. Now obviously, to get some sort of advantage from this card, you probably want to average 4 or more spells in your hand. The battlecry makes it a liability where if you end up not having spells in your hand, then it's just a bad card. It's one of those that's just too weird and probably won't see any play. Next up is Beakered Lightning, 0 mana shaman spell that deals 1 damage to all minions, overload for 2. The advantage with this card is that you can play it with 0 mana and then pay the 2 mana later. So maybe you could also use the overload advantage to synergize with some of the new overload related cards, but really I only expect this card to see play if there's a crazy early game aggro deck, like if somehow Odd Paladin becomes even better. It's a pretty weak card to begin with, and I don't think the overload synergy is going to be that strong, so I don't think it's going to see any play. Next up is Bulldozer, 9 mana 9/7 mech. Again, the artwork is amazing with this one, looking like a transformer, but card wise it's too expensive of a card to see play. Divine Shield is great with mechs because then you can magnetize and trade for cheap, but being at this expensive cost, you can't have too many minions magnetized to this on the same turn. But I don't think anyone's going to include it in their deck. If they had this in the Transformers movies, maybe I'd actually watch them. Next up is Cloak Scale Chemist, 2 mana 1/2 neutral minion with Stealth and Divine Shield. So the Stealth lets you buff this in Priest or Paladin, and Divine Shield also helps save you against any board clears. Even though the stats aren't terrible with all of these extra benefits, it's still just not that good of a card. There are way better 2-drops out there, and if you have to buff this in order to get value off of the Divine Shield, and if the Stealth doesn't really add too much to this card, then I don't think it's really worth playing. Next is Crazed Chemist, 5 mana 4/4 rogue minion with combo give a friendly minion +4 attack. It basically allows you to run 2 more Cold Bloods in your rogue deck, and while it's not as good because of its expensive cost, the tempo of this minion is pretty crazy. 5 mana 4/4 is well worth the immediate 4 damage, and I'd expect this to see play in a lot of tempo and aggro rogue decks. Next up is Damaged Stegatron, 6 mana 5/12 mech with taunt and battlecry, deal 6 damage to this minion. So in actuality, it would end up being a 6 mana 5/6 when you play this out on the board. So maybe in Priest you could use some of their spells or their hero power just to heal this up for relatively cheap mana. If there's some way you can recruit or summon this minion, that would be pretty nice because then you get a 5/12 out on the board, but it doesn't really feel like there's an effective way of getting this minion out on the board for positive value. Next up is Ectomancy, 6 mana warlock spell that summons copies of all demons you control. Cube Lock, no! So this is kind of like Sudden Genesis if you want to think about that card, and I know a lot of people don't think that card's good because it isn't. While you don't need to damage your minions to get this requirement, it does only apply to demons, and it's an expensive card. One thing to notice about Ectomancy and Sudden Genesis is that at most you're gonna summon 3 copies of a minion, because if you have 3 or 4 demons out on the board, you can only summon 3 more. And so the first thought is of course Cube Lock, where if you had some Voidwalkers out on the board, you can use this to summon more. And maybe in some cases where you just destroyed your cube and summoned 2 Voidlords, you could Ectomancy to get 4 of them out on the board, but a lot of the time a Cube Lock has a bunch of minions out on the board, and mostly they're the 1/3 Voidwalkers clogging the board. I don't think this card could really get you value that way. I think the best use of it would actually be Doomguard as some sort of final combo to finish off your opponent. Cube Lock might struggle against some early game or other control decks next expansion, so Ectomancy might be a card that helps them adapt and change into more of a, or maybe it's a card to give hope to the people that want that deck to work, but in reality, Cube Lock will now die. Next up is Electro Right, 3 mana 3/3 neutral minion with the battlecry. If you're holding a spell that costs 5 or more, gain +1/+1. So this card's kind of weird. The battlecry reward, a 3 mana 4/4, it seems like it's a tempo card, but the requirement is that you have a spell that costs 5 or more, and that's something kind of hard to do, or at least it's encouraging a deck that uses more expensive cards. The reward and the requirement don't really match up, where one's more for a control deck and the other for more of a tempo deck. So I think this card just overall doesn't work and it won't see any play. Next up is Elementary Reaction, 2 mana shaman spell, draw a card, copy it if you played an elemental last turn. So this is like Rogue's Mimic Pod, except it's for shaman, and it has the elemental requirement. This card is really good in any shaman deck that runs a few elementals. Really good card draw and value gain for shaman. Next is Glowstone Technician, 6 mana 3/4 paladin minion with the battlecry, give all minions in your hand +2/+2. This is a big hand buff, perhaps for an egg, but really it doesn't need any buffing synergy for this to be good. Just hitting this on 2 minions gives you 7-8 in stats. The problem with this card, of course, is that it's really slow. You're playing a 6 mana 4/3, and to get those +2/+2 stats from all of your other minions, it's going to take multiple turns to get them out there. On top of this, I don't think there's really a Paladin deck that can support this kind of slow gameplay. It's a card that's going to be amazing in Arena, and while the power level is really crazy, I just don't know if it's going to see play in Standard. This is one of those cards that's really up in the air for me, but I have to say I'm leaning towards it not seeing that much play. Next up is Goblin Bomb. You've already seen this one. You're not going to include it into your deck, but you're going to see it a little bit from other cards. Next up is Goblin Prank, 2 mana hunter spell, give a friendly minion +3/+3 and rush. It dies at the end of the turn. This is a really powerful tempo card. Of course, the minion you use this on is going to die at the end of the turn, so either you want to use those stats to the full potential and just trade this completely into a minion, or you could also run this on a death rattle. Let's say an egg. It is crazy tempo swing to give a minion +3/+3 for only 2 mana, and while your minion is guaranteed to die, if it has a powerful death rattle, then that's completely fine. By the time I got to this card, I kind of realized that, wow, Hunter actually looks really strong. There's a lot of really good cards in Hunter being printed, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of Hunter deck comes out of it, because I think there's going to be a strong tier 1 Hunter deck, and there's going to be 2 copies of Goblin Prank in it. Next up is Holomancer, 5 mana 3/3 neutral minion. After your opponent plays a minion, summon a 1/1 copy of it. Well, from one of the best cards we go to one of the worst. It's a cool idea, I guess, but 5 mana 3/3, the stats are absolutely terrible. Your opponent has a lot of control over what you summon, so they probably aren't going to give you a Lich King. This dies way too easily, it's way too expensive, it's just bleh. Next up is Kaboombot, 3 mana 2/2 neutral mech with the death rattle, deal 4 damage to a random enemy minion. So the hunter minion Spider Bomb is obviously better, but this is a neutral minion, so it's not going to be as good. But I think just like Spider Bomb, the randomness of the death rattle can be kind of detrimental to this card. It's not a terrible card like the last one, but it's not really that good, and I don't think it's going to see any play in any deck. Next up is Loose Specimen, 5 mana 6/6 neutral beast with the battle cry, deal 6 damage randomly split among other friendly minions. So just to clarify, this minion only deals damage to your friendly minions. This means alone on the board, it's just a 5 mana 6/6, which is pretty good. But if you have other minions on the board, it's a little bit less so. In Warrior, you could use Security Rover and Eternium Rover to get you armor and summon some 2/3s. You could also get draw out of Acolyte of Pain, but really dealing the 6 damage to your own friendly minions isn't worth the 5 mana 6/6 stats. And in the end, it's not going to see play. Unless of course you only have eggs out on the board. Next up is Mecharoo, 1 mana 1/1 neutral mech with the death rattle, summon a 1/1 Joey bot. Summon a 1/1 Joey bot. It's basically the same card as the Warlock 1/1 with the death rattle that would summon another 1/1. And just like that card, this isn't really going to see play unless there's a super aggro deck that is desperate for more 1-drops. Next up is Microtech Controller, 3 mana 2/1 neutral minion with the battlecry, summon 2 1/1 microbots. This is more mech board filler, except the minion itself is not a mech, and also the 1 health across the board for all these minions is really bad, and this is not going to see any play. Piloted Reaper is a 4 mana 4/3 neutral mech with the death rattle, summon a random minion from your hand that costs 2 or less. So this is like Piloted Shredder, except you have more control over the minion you summon, and it's also worse. It's really hard to consistently have a minion in your hand ready for this card, especially if you're playing a tempo deck. Maybe if you're playing a recruit paladin deck that already has a bunch of 2s and 1-drops, but still just playing a 2-cost minion in an aggro deck usually isn't a problem. With Piloted Reaper, you're spending more mana to later get stats that you could probably play by that time anyways. It's a bad card, it's not going to see play. Next up is Rocket Boots, 2 mana warrior spell, give a minion rush and draw a card. Wow, times have changed since a warrior spell used to give a minion charge. The biggest problem with this card is that it's really low value. There are better ways to draw cards, there are better minions that just already have rush. It's a nice concept, but it just isn't going to work for a warrior deck. Unless of course draw is really that crucial. A Dead Man's Hand deck might be able to use Rocket Boots just for some more draw and to clear some of the enemy board. If a warrior needs a lot of draw, then maybe we'll see play. Next up is Rusty Recycler, 5 mana 2/6 neutral mech with taunt and lifesteal. So this Wally looking motherfucker has lifesteal, which is great with magnetic cards. I think it's going to be a really big advantage to be able to buff lifesteal mechs, and then not only deal more damage, but also heal your hero. Still, at 5 mana for only 2/6 stats, it's not really that good against aggro, and it's not really worth that much in control. If this was a 4 mana 2/6 with taunt and lifesteal, maybe I would consider it, but it's too expensive, and I don't think it's going to see any play. Alright, and now here is where we start to get into some Rager territory. Spark Drill is a 6 mana 5/1 neutral mech with Rush, and Death Rattle add 2 1/1 sparks with Rush to your hand. Unfortunately, I don't think this card is very good. The Rush with 5 damage is pretty good and can kill a lot of medium minions, and the Death Rattle itself is gonna give you 2 1/1 sparks with Rush, but I think the real downfall of this card is that at 6 mana it's just so expensive only to deal 5 damage and not have anything left out on the board. With other good board removals, you usually have a guaranteed clear and also a decent minion out on the board. This is just paying 6 mana for too little, even with the Death Rattle. And next up is Spark Engine, 2 mana 2/1 neutral mech with the Battlecry, add a 1/1 spark with Rush to your hand. Just, no, this isn't good. Next up is Spring Rocket, 3 mana 2/1 neutral mech with the Battlecry, deal 2 damage. So the Battlecry is actually pretty good for clear, and this could be a decent card if it had somewhat of a good stat line. Fireplume Phoenix is much better, and it's just worth the extra cost to get a better minion out on the board. I think this could be a real test of mech synergy if they'd rather play this card than Fireplume Phoenix, just because it's a mech and you could magnetize it later. And the most recent addition to the Rager family is Steel Rager, 4 mana 5/1 neutral mech with Rush. It's definitely a faster and more affordable version of Spark Drill, but again, you're paying 4 mana for 5 damage out on the board. The one hope with this card is if you can spend a little bit more money to buff its health and allow it to actually trade and stay alive out on the board. I have a little bit more hope that this Rager will actually be able to do something, but the mech synergy has to really be strong in order for this to work. If you can buff its health for cheap mana, then it will be a strong tempo card. Next up is Topsy Turvy, 0 mana priest spell, swap a minion's attack and health. Dear God, please let this be a sign that Inner Fire is going to rotate to the Hall of Fame. But yeah, this is another card you could use, I guess, instead of Inner Fire. It's obviously not as good in some situations, but it's actually a card that could also be used on the defensive to turn one of your enemy high attack minions instead into a high health minion. It's interesting. To be honest, I haven't played a lot of Inner Fire Priest, especially in the recent expansion. If I were to guess, they can usually either draw or discover Inner Fire by the time they have this combo. I think this would just clog the pool of spells you want to discover in Inner Fire Priest. But again, I haven't played the deck a lot, so let me know in the comments down below if you think that deck could use this card, or I guess if there's another deck that could. Next up is Toxologist, 2 mana 2/2 neutral minion with the Battlecry, give your weapon +1 attack. So maybe this could work in an even or an aggro rogue. Unfortunately, that deck also usually runs Keleseth, so this would be fighting a spot for it, and it would definitely lose. Maybe its best bet would be in a Kingsbane deck that would put in all the weapon buffs they can. It doesn't seem like a really great card, and probably won't see any play. Next up is Unpowered Mauler, 2 mana 2/4 neutral mech that can only attack if you cast a spell this turn. There's a good amount of decks that could complete this requirement. The problem is, I don't think the rewards are really that great. In the early game, 2 mana 2/4, it's decent, but is it worth casting a spell every turn to ensure this can attack? That's just not worth the effort for a reward that isn't that great. Next up is Venomizer, 2 mana 2/2 hunter mech with magnetic and poisonous. First of all, 2 mana 2/2 mech, that's not terrible. Then you give it magnetic, which is like, wow, okay, that's nice. And then you give it poison, which makes it amazing. It's really good for any tempo deck, and of course with magnetic, you can buff this to make a minion that will last longer out on the board, or encourage your opponent to destroy it with one of their powerful spells. The one problem this card could run into is if the meta is too fast for poisonous to be useful. If all the gameplay is just a bunch of small minions fighting each other, then a poisonous minion isn't going to have that much value. It's a crazy strong card for a mech hunter, and it could be a serious form of single target removal. Next up is Violet Haze, 3 mana rogue spell, add 2 random Death Rattle cards to your hand. You know what, this is another one of those no cards. The random effect is bad, it's a slow card. Listen rogue, take it from Hunter, this is not how you do Death Rattle. And next up is Whirly Glider, 2 mana 2/1 neutral minion with the Battlecry, summon a 0/2 Goblin Bomb. So once again, 2/1 stats are pretty bad. The Goblin Bomb is nice, it's a mech. It's boring, it's not good, probably won't see any play. And last up, oh wait, we've already seen this one, Mechano Egg. That means we're done. all 130 or so cards. Thank you all for watching the series. If you missed any, or if you missed the part 1 of this finale, it will be on the screen now. Shout out to Blizzard for making Mechano Egg. The Boomsday Project expansion will be dropping in 6 days on the 7th. I'll be going through the cards and deck ideas once again, and I'll put out a video on what my predictions are before the expansion drops. It's been a pleasure as always. Thank you for watching the series, and until next time, ta-ta.